So I feel like I'm in a pretty interesting situation. I make these YouTube videos, I talk about books all the time, I'm reading all day, I'm reading just when I can, but I always struggle with figuring out what I'm going to read. I know what you're thinking, Chris, don't you have a TBR list right there? And you're right, I do. I still can't decide. It's like that thing where the more options you have, the more choices you have, the harder it is to make a choice in the first place. And I do know that all of these books are gonna be pretty good reads, but I still struggle. So what we're gonna do today is I'm gonna read the first chapter of each one of these books on my TBR and hope, absolutely pray, that I find a book that grabs my attention, that makes me want to read it. And then hopefully by the end of this video, I'll have the next book that I'm gonna read. All right, y'all, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy. If this isn't a welcome back and this is your first time somehow stumbling onto this channel, I know you got one quick question. Yo, Chris reads? And yeah, I do know how to read. Allegedly. And this is actually one of the books on my TBR. So let's just get this video started off rip. It's that fast, we're going. So I've actually already started reading a little bit of The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. This was gonna be like my next read that I made a video about, but I mean, look at this, bro. It's like twice as thick as my glasses, like it's crazy. But I am exactly, I'm a page folder, I'm a bunny ear, don't get mad at me. I'm actually about 31 pages, into this book. So what I've read so far are the prelude and the prologue, which kind of cover two different like millennia of characters, right? So the prelude is really interesting. We're following one main character so far. His name is Kalak, who is one of these heralds who is supposed to like fight for good and justice and all those good things, right? He's supposed to meet up with 9 other heralds in this like meeting place to like make sure that they're all okay. But when he gets there, it's only one other guy and 7 other swords in a circle, like in the ground. The guy he meets is called Jezrien, and Jezrien is like, yo, everything that we've done so far is like really tough and really powerful, but the other heralds have kind of decided like, we're not gonna do this anymore. Like, this isn't what we're built for. After a conversation, Jezrien and Kalak decide to be the other 2 heralds to kind of disband the oath pact and not like hold it up anymore. And they specifically mention that by the 7 giving up the oath pact and by Jezrien and Kalak giving up the oath pact, that leaves one other herald by themselves to uphold everything in this like weird kind of like purgatory universe that's like stuck in battle all the time. So that's really interesting. I want to see if like the herald who died in battle makes like a comeback. So like in this universe, once they die, they come back to life and they have to keep on fighting, which is why all the other heralds like decided to give that up because they were tired of living that life. So I'm interested to see if this herald kind of makes a return later on in the story and is kind of mad at all his friends for like all the people that he essentially worked with for abandoning him in this like war-torn, like live, die, repeat universe. Fast forward 4,500 years later, we're now like at the point of view of this assassin named Szeth, who is sent to kill like a king in this castle during like a very popular dinner party. And here is where we start to discover like kind of the more fantasy elements of this book. A lot of lore gets dropped in this. Like obviously the prelude was like literally just setting up the world, but we also get a lot more information in this section about like the politics and the kind of divides and things like that, which has always been my kind of like worry when it comes to reading fantasy. Like obviously this is already like a pretty thick book, and I feel like I have to take notes when I read this because I'm gonna miss like a detail or a connection or a relationship. And that's like kind of, I read this like 31 pages probably like a week or 2 ago, and I just haven't picked it up yet because it's so like daunting and intimidating to look at all this and be like, I gotta remember a majority of this. But we see Szeth kind of using these powers, these like surge abilities, which I thought was really cool. The way Brandon Sanderson's able to write these powers in a way that like isn't confusing because they involve like messing with gravity and messing with orientations, and the way that Sanderson was able to write that in a way that wasn't confusing I thought was really cool. And then this kind of prologue ends with Szeth killing the king that he was sent to kill in this like really cool battle. And then the king gives him an item and tells him that this enemy group can't have it, and then also gives him a message to pass along to his brother. And Szeth does this, and then that's the end of the chapter, and that begins the actual chapter 1 of the book. So when it comes to like an introduction to a book, I really enjoyed this. Again, it's more just me being like intimidated to read this more so than it was like bad writing or anything like that. Because the writing is very good. It's very interesting. It's very action packed. I know the rest of this book, like the entirety of this, isn't all action or anything like that. But I do think that it was a very good taste into what I can expect out of this book, the writing style that I can expect from this book. And also, if I do choose to read this, I'll probably give this chapter a reread again because there is a lot of like lore and stuff that gets mentioned. So I might have like this book and my notebook just next to each other and be like, oh, a name was mentioned. Ooh, a relationship was mentioned. But yeah, even though I read this a little while ago, I gave it a skim now, and I think it is like a very good introduction for this video. But now I think we're gonna pick up something else. Subliminal: How Your Unconscious Mind Rules Your Behavior by Leonard Lodnow. I apologize if I read that name incorrectly. The little blurb on the back says, over the past 2 decades of neurological research, it has become increasingly clear that the way we experience the world, our perception, behavior, memory, and social judgment is largely driven by the mind's subliminal processes and not by the conscious ones, as we have long believed. Now, I mentioned this a while ago. I did read this when I kind of started reading, and I would read this before bed, and I would be like half asleep, like, ugh. So even though I got to the last page, like I couldn't tell you a single thing that was mentioned in this book. So I want to give the first chapter a read and then see if it's a book that I should read next. Like I said, we had a good start with Way of Kings. So this is going to have to be pretty good to get to the top of the list. We're starting with another prologue. I'm sitting on the floor because wow, that chair is really loud. But oh my god, this is such a good intro to a book. Technically it is a prologue, so it was only 5 pages, I think, maybe 6 pages, but it does a great job of establishing what this book is about, kind of in a deeper way than just reading the title or the blurb on the back does. The author goes through talking about like the very first experiments and the very first scientists that studied kind of subliminal thought in our subconscious, but also goes into detail about how these new technologies and these new ways of study have kind of developed as time goes on, and how this new area of science called, I think he says it right here, social neuroscience to be specific, how that field has kind of grown and elevated to the point that you could write an entire like almost 300-page book about it. 218, so maybe not 300, but you get what I mean. I think one of my favorite sentences here, or sections I should say, is Carl Jung believed that to learn about the human experience, it was important to study dreams and mythology. History is the story of events that played out in civilization, but dreams and myths are expressions of the human heart. The themes and archetypes of our dreams and myths, Jung pointed out, transcend time and culture. They arise from unconscious instincts that governed our behavior long before civilization papered over them and obscured them. And they therefore teach us about what it means to be human at the deepest level. Like just that little blurb right there, I think does such a good job at telling you how important it is to learn about the subconscious and also how important it is to read this book. So I think this might be above Way of Kings, because for some reason this seems less intimidating than Way of Kings. And even though it's like obviously something that's incredibly like, maybe difficult isn't the right word, but can be hard to understand when you're talking about like neuroscience, but this seems like, I love the way this author writes. The intro is just a good example of it. I think the prologue does a very good job of introducing you to the concepts that are going to be talked about in this book. And yeah, I think this is I'm gonna put this above Way of Kings for now, but I might change my mind. Let's move on to book 3. So I actually got this book, I think, for Christmas one year, maybe my birthday, but this is essentially like a written out version of the ESPN film series. Technically it's a documentary if I remember correctly, where they had a bunch of basketball players from current times, from the past, like legends, talk about different aspects of the game. I remember like kind of reading this a little bit, but I think the main thing that has turned me off from reading this, like as I've gotten older, is I think the premise or the way this book is laid out, the format of this book is like, here's a question and here's everybody's responses, or here's a topic and here's everybody's responses to that topic or to that question. So I'm not really sure if that like leads to like a cohesive story. And my worry is that this is like one of those like book adaptations of like big movies or something like that for like younger audiences. And while I don't think this is for younger audiences, I just don't know if like the format is going to keep me like entertained enough to continue reading the book. And I think it might just be like a book you pick up every once in a while. So let me get through this. It doesn't look to be that long, maybe like 5 or 6 pages again, but let's get started. So Basketball Love Story is kind of exactly what I thought it would be, at least this very beginning section was. It brings like a premise or a question, and then you have interviews from a bunch of people trying to like answer their premise or their kind of experience with it. And the reason I say experience is because while the kind of intro section is about when basketball or when these players and coaches fell in love with the game of basketball, I kind of peeped into the second little section, and it talks about Celtics versus Lakers, Russell's dominance, West's heartbreak, and those balloons. And it kind of introduces like an era or a time, and then it asks people from that era or time kind of what their opinions and like stories and things like that. So I think that's a really interesting premise. And also I hope they don't stick just to people like in that time period. Like when it comes to legendary like NBA players, basketball players, like I want to learn what they lived through in that time, but I also want to learn kind of what people nowadays or from people past those times but before now, I want to know what their opinions on that time and on what that era was. And this book total is a little over 400 pages long, but I think it'll be a quick read again because it's not like a narrative or anything like that. It's kind of like subject answers. But I think this was a very good little introductory section to the book. I think, like I said, I still don't know if I would read this book like straight, like beginning to end. I think this is supposed to be a book that you kind of pick up and put down and don't read for a little bit. And because since it's about like different situations and different questions, it's not like you have to read it like chronologically or anything. Like you could skip back and forth if you like. So because of that, I'm going to put this book towards the bottom of the list. I am excited to read this now that kind of I have a little bit of a better idea of its contents, but I think we're good with Basketball Love Story. And I should watch the movie too. I don't know if it's like, I know ESPN and Disney are kind of like this right now, but I don't know if it's available on Disney Plus or something like that. So I'm going to look it up and see if I can watch the documentary after I finish this book. But that's enough about basketball. Let's move on to something else. I actually got this from Joybird Books, which is a local bookstore in Central Florida. Shout out Joybird Books. But like I've said in earlier videos, 100 Things You Should Know About Pirates, top tier book. So I wanted to get kind of a more official history of Pirates, but I'll see if I can find the exact review. But when I was looking, after I had bought the book, because I bought the book just literally off of the cover, I saw a review that someone said this is just pirate accounting. And that kind of turned me off from the book pretty heavily. But I'm excited to read it because like pirates were like something that I loved as a kid, and to have like what is considered like the greatest text of pirate history on the planet, like obviously that's an awesome review of a book that you want to read, especially when you're as interested in the subject as I am. But it is pretty thick, all things considered. I don't know if y'all could tell, especially in comparison to like the 5 or 6 pages for the other books that we've read. But I think this gives us a little introduction into the author, and then how the author themselves had their interest in pirates and pirate history and pirate accounting, as well as like the context for the history. So I think this is a very deep and thorough introduction, but especially when a book is like this thick, you want as thorough of an introduction as you can. So we're going to get started on this. I just got a headache. This isn't gonna be fun.
A few moments later.
So it's been more than a few moments. It's probably been like an hour and a half. My headache only proceeded to get worse. So I drank some water, ate some food, took a nap, a shower, all that good business. And now we're back. And I also was able to finish the 20-ish pages of the intro to A General History of Pirates. Now the main reason for some of these books I chose to read like the prologue or the prelude or the introduction as opposed to like the first actual chapter of the book is because I think that in certain situations the introduction provides more to the book or gives me more information about the book than the first chapter would. And I think this book was a good example of that. Even though it was a little bit long, the introduction essentially goes over Daniel Defoe, who he was, kind of his start with writing about the sea and about pirates. You follow him from being like a working man and a whole bunch of debt to being one of the leading journalists in like this late 1600s, early 1700s time in England. You also follow him as he begins to sort of fall in love with the sea and to fall in love with pirates, or at least the idea of them, and everything that he goes through and all the people he meets and all the information that he gathers in order to create what is essentially, I think, 3 or 4 different editions of this book. What I also think was really useful, and it says right here on the cover, edited by Manuel Scohorn. I apologize if I'm saying that incorrectly, even though I definitely know I am. Is he talks about kind of how he made the edits and what edits he made to this. So he talks about, and it's very easy, like on one, like he talks about it right here where it says the text, and then right here. So it's not even 2 pages of him explaining himself and why he chose to do what edits that he did, how he rearranged certain parts of the book, how he was able to provide things from the first edition of General History to the fourth edition, of General History, and how he was able to combine kind of everything that Defoe wrote into one comprehensive, like very easily readable, but also incredibly informative text. I am going to put this at the bottom because this is not only is it physically a heavy read, but I also think it's going to be like a very mentally taxing read. And I don't think I'm in the mood for that right now. I know there's probably going to be a time, maybe when I go to New York, maybe when I'm on that plane, on that subway, a long car ride somewhere or something like that, I'll take a deep chunk out of this. But right now, I'm kind of not in the mood for this, so this is going towards the bottom of the pile. Next up, even though I do have volumes 1 and 2, I am going to treat this as one giant compendium thickness of a book. So I am going to read the first chapter of the first story in volume 1, and then if I choose to read this one next, or whenever I do choose to read this book, I'll just read both of them back to back. I will be skipping the introduction on this book because, like I said, I have read it before, but we are going to get started with the first chapter in A Study in Scarlet. It's crazy to think that if John Watson was a little better at taking care of his money, Watson and Holmes would never be a thing. So a very quick first chapter here. We're essentially following what are notes, what are kind of journal entries of John Watson, who is a retired Army veteran. He gets injured during the Second Afghan War. I believe this takes place in the late early 1900s. And after being like medically discharged from the military, he's getting some money from them. He starts living kind of like a lavish, quote unquote, lavish lifestyle, but he's not really doing anything. And he decides, hey, I'm getting this money from the government. I might as well try and do something with my life. The first thing I got to do is kind of hone in on my finances. And instead of living in this hotel, I need to find a roommate. He ends up running into a friend from school. And once he's telling this friend about how, yeah, I want to change my life, I'm looking for a roommate, he's like, bro, my boy is also looking for a roommate, but he's a little weird. And that roommate ends up being Sherlock Holmes. The chapter ends with Watson and Holmes meeting each other and their friend kind of introducing them, and them agreeing to look at the rooms in Baker Street before like making their living situation, or before finalizing their like combined living situation. One of the things I've loved about this is that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle knows how to write. Like, he's a very good writer, and it makes it a lot easier to, like, I don't want to say like skim, but like breeze through what you're reading, which is essentially like early 1900s English literature, and that can be like kind of a turnoff to some people, but I think the writing in these books is so well done that it's not like, you don't need like a Shakespearean English degree to read this or understand what's going on. So I don't know where I'm going to rank this. I have a physical stack. Hold up, let me see. I have a physical stack right there that I'm trying to keep track of, so I don't know where exactly I would rank this book so far. I think I'm going to put this second. I think I'm going to put it second on the list, beneath Subliminal but above Way of Kings. And I think if I finish this, it's like a good warm-up to Way of Kings in terms of like, even though if this is like an accumulation of a bunch of stories, kind of the length of this book might get me warmed up, or at least a little more warmed up to Way of Kings than like something super tiny would. So we're going to put this at second on the list, and we're going to add this to third on the list. So it's going to be Subliminal, Sherlock Holmes 1, Sherlock Holmes 2. I think that's the vibe. We're going to continue this video with one of my favorite books that I read 90% of all year, which is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I've explained it in other videos, or I've explained it a few times before, but I essentially read like, I had 40 or 50 pages left in this book, thought I finished it, and then proceeded to completely forget about it. So I did forget a lot about what happens in this book, so I want to reread it because I remember enjoying the book and I want to finish it. Let's get this. I'm so excited to reread this. So already, this might be at the top of the list. God, I forget how good the beginning of this book is. 18 pages in, and for those of you that haven't read 100 Years of Solitude, you're essentially following this like family lineage in this city of Macondo, and you follow them kind of as they go through their life. Again, you're following I think 3 generations of the Buendia family, starting with Jose Arcadio Buendia, and there's even like a little family tree in the beginning of the book because a lot of these characters end up having like very similar names. I also think this book has one of the greatest starting lines I've ever read, which is, many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. You're following this family, and you're following Jose Arcadio Buendia as they live in this city, in this town called Macondo. And every year in March, they get visited by a group of gypsies. And these gypsies bring like stories and products and inventions from all over the world into this town that is like seemingly in the middle of nowhere. The first thing, I'm reading this right now, the first thing that they bring is like what are essentially magnets, like incredibly strong magnets. Then they bring this like telescope magnifying glass thing, and the people of the town have never seen anything like this before. So they're like paying money to see someone like 100 feet away, like an arm's length away, I think is how it's described in the book. And Jose Arcadio Buendia decides to try and use this for like a weapon of war. That doesn't work out. Eventually, one of the gypsies that Jose Arcadio Buendia has become friends with gives him like all of these like samples and tools and beakers to build like his own like alchemist laboratory in his house. And at the end, the chapter ends with what the chapter began with, which is Jose Arcadio Buendia taking his 2 sons, Aureliano and Jose Arcadio. Like I said, they all have similar names, so if you get confused, it's okay. He's taking his children to another one of these like giant, they're almost like festivals, almost like wild farmers markets that come into this town in the middle of nowhere with tales from what's going on in the rest of the world. And he is taking his children to see ice for the very first time, something that they've never even known existed before. And at the end of the chapter, he's paying money, because you had to pay money to get into the tent to look at the ice, and then you have to pay money to touch the ice. And it says right here, he paid another 5, and with his hand on the cake, as if giving testimony on the Holy Scripture, he exclaimed, "This is the great invention of our time." And that's for ice. So I think this is a great first chapter, a great introduction into this book. It does a lot to kind of show the reader not just the kind of universe that you're in, but also the style of writing, which I love this style of writing. I've read some reviews about this book with people saying that it was confusing or hard to follow, and that was definitely the case the first time that I read this. But I think once you can sort of like, for lack of a better term, like stop treating this book so seriously, it becomes such beautiful writing and becomes such beautiful storytelling. And it was that even before you had to like not get confused by all the names being similar and like what seems like randomness, but is really just the world building of this weird city. But I love this book. I want to reread it again immediately. I'm going to be putting it, I don't know if y'all can see it right there. It's going right there. It's going at the very top of the to read this first kind of chapter, this first little section sold it for me. And I can't wait to get back into the world of Macondo and 100 Years of Solitude. So we only have 2 books left currently. We have Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. I have the Penguin Classics cover. I think I got this. I think I might have taken this from like a high school teacher's classroom. Don't tell nobody. And then we also have the major or the mass paperback version of Dune, which I also got at Afterwards in New York. Again, this book also seems a little intimidating, if I'm being honest. So I'm going to read this first. I think the first chapter, the first section is about 20 or so pages. So I think we should be able to knock this out pretty quickly, and then we can move our way over to the last book, which is Crime and Punishment. This was a very, very good introductory chapter, introductory section, and I think I liked it a little more than the introduction to Way of Kings, if I'm being honest. You're introduced to this world of Arrakis, this like desert planet. You're introduced to this little like the Atreides family, and you're introduced to Paul, who seems to be this like son of some very important people, of the king, if I'm not mistaken, of the duke, excuse me. I don't want to get any royal lines mixed up. He's the son of a duke, and this old, like kind of older, powerful woman comes through to like test Paul and make sure that he's like a human, because if he's a human, he has a very high possibility of being this, I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, the Kwisatz Haderach. I'll put it up on screen. I'll find something that pronounces it correctly, because I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But it sort of shows you, again, like the political system that's been set up in this world, and also does a very small job of establishing like the more fantasy or sci-fi elements that are going to be kind of, I'm assuming, littered throughout this book. And it definitely got me, and it definitely captured my attention. Of course, the Dune movies have come out with Timothée Chalamet in them, and I've only heard good things about those movies, but me being the type of person I am, I want to read the book before I watch the movies, so this might be, looking at the list, I don't think I want to read this more than I want to reread 100 Years of Solitude, but this is immediately going into second place. Like, this intro really got me. Like, I'm really interested in the world that's being set up. It gave you enough, I would argue, to like pique your curiosity. I think one of the things that I'm realizing about Way of Kings is that it felt like it gave me too much off rip, and that's what's leading to like the intimidating, I don't know if I want to read this or not factor. But this is giving you just enough to like bite onto, just enough to be like, ooh, let me keep reading to see what this is about. And then I'm sure chapter 2 is going to have something that's like, ooh, let me keep reading so I can see what this is about. And then you read chapter 3 and things like that. So I think I'm going to put this at a solid 2. Last, but certainly not least, we have Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I have heard many a thing about this book. Obviously, it's a classic for a reason. I've never opened this, and then when I went to open this to film this section of the video, I realized that some pages in the very beginning of the book are falling off. Like, I don't know if y'all could tell, but like, yeah, this page is kind of falling off a little bit, so I have to be very careful. But I am, again, like I did with the previous books, I am going to skip the introduction, but I think when I read this book, I will read the introduction. They can do a good job of providing context to stories, and especially with a classic like this that was written forever ago, that has like a legendary kind of following, for lack of a better term, behind it. I think the introduction will do a good job in, again, just setting the tone for me reading this book. And with that, we have made it to the end of the first chapter of Crime and Punishment, and I don't know what I was expecting, but this wasn't it. So we get introduced to our main character, who's named Raskolnikov, and in the beginning, this first chapter, he's kind of like down on his dumps. Like, he is like having trouble eating, he is way behind on rent, he has to pawn things to his landlady in order to even get close to like delaying rent, not even making rent, just delaying rent. When we read their first interaction together, or at least the first interaction that we as readers get a hold of, as she is getting the money to pay him back for this like silver watch that he's pawning to her to like somewhat delay having to pay rent, he very quickly considers like robbing her. He's like, all right, well, she walked away into this room. She's taking a while, so she probably has a lot of keys. Oh, the keys for the lock where she keeps all her money must be small because, like, she has to search for the key and it's not too big, so she isn't finding it immediately. Like, this man does not seem to be mentally all the way there. But I'm interested. I would still argue there are a couple more first chapters that were like kind of caught me off the hook a little more than this book. But one of the things I will say, this and The Gambler were published in 1866, and the writing does not feel like that. I have read books that were published later than 1866 that are harder to read than this book. I think the writing on this is phenomenal so far, and I'm barely a chapter in, like I'm barely 10 pages in at this point. And in no way does the writing drag. That's one of the things I noticed with Dune as well, and especially with 100 Years of Solitude, is that even though the writing might be complex, or even though the writing might be a little older, or there might be a lot of names and lore being dropped, like, it is not difficult to read. So like I was able to breeze through this and Dune and 100 Years of Solitude, even though those are quote-unquote complex books, because the writing is so good. I'm trying to decide if I want to read this before I read Way of Kings. I know this book is going to get better. I know that was a very tame kind of, we're just following this guy. This is like a slow burn into like the main crux of the book. And I don't want to burden the first chapter with giving me everything. But in terms of like gotcha, in terms of gotcha ability, I don't think this was all the way up there. You know what? I'm gonna go crazy. Come with me, follow. So this is what we got in terms of first chapter readability. And while this didn't grab me as much as something like 100 Years of Solitude did, I think it's a solid second. So this is it. This is the final order. I read all of these first chapters and or introductions, and this is the order I think that I'm going to be reading my physical TBR. And I think this is a pretty good stack. And again, we are going to treat Sherlock Holmes 1 and 2 as kind of one gargantuan book. But even with that in mind, like, I think this is a solid selection of reading. What's crazy is I know it looks like it's super late, and I did turn off the big light. It's like 5:45. But that's going to be it, y'all. I want to thank you for making it this far into the video, and you, that's right, I mean you, for helping me organize my TBR and kind of figuring out in what order I'm going to read them, especially like based on the first chapter. I think this is a better angle for the outro. But thank you, first and foremost, thank you specifically for making it this far and for helping me organize my TBR based on the coolness factor of the first chapter. I know a lot of people say don't judge a book by its cover, and that's obviously a very good way of living your literature-based life, but I thought this was a kind of like a fun challenge, for lack of a better term, to decide how I want to organize my reading. I'm not the kind of person that can like pick up and drop a book and pick up and drop a book and read 2 or 3 things at a time. I still prefer to read one book at a time and kind of read them in like succession. So I think this was a good challenge for me to help me understand kind of exactly how I'm going to be reading things. So I think this was a good challenge to kind of help me understand like how I'm going to be reading things. And this is something I would tell y'all to do. Like, if you're not sure of what book you're going to read next, or what, maybe you have a couple options of what books you want to read next, read the first chapter. What's the word? I'm not going to tell nobody. Are you a snitch? Are you going to tell? I'm not going to tell nobody. So just do it. Do something small to help yourself out. Life is too short. But again, that's going to be it. Make sure you leave a like for Molly the Money Tree down below. If you enjoyed this video at all, leave a like, but specifically for Molly the Money Tree. If you enjoyed anything at all about what I said, maybe you have an opinion on some of the books that I read in today's video that are still right there. I gotta move those back over here at some point, and I'm not gonna do that probably until tomorrow because I'm lazy. But if you have any opinion on any of those books, if you have any opinions on something I should read or anything I said in this video, leave a comment down below. And if you liked anything at all, if you liked the video, if you liked what I talked about, if you think I'm handsome, if you like Molly, not that kind of Molly, I mean that one, make sure you leave a subscribe down below. I would truly appreciate it. My videos pretty recently have been doing awesome, and I have nobody else to thank for that but y'all. And I really appreciate the support that my channel and these videos have gotten, and I really hope that in the coming months I can kind of dedicate more more time to things, and hopefully go to 2 videos a week, go to 7 videos, go to 104 videos a week. I do not care. I just want to keep on doing this. But leaving a like, subscribe, comment, all that good business, any and all of that helps me out so much, and it lets me know that the content I'm making and putting out, people are enjoying. So like I said, if you deem it worthy, please do any and all of those things. But again, I hope you specifically, have a good day. I hope you do something that made you some money. I hope you did something that makes you happy. And I have a problem with outros, and I don't do them fast enough. So I'll catch y'all next time. Peace.